So I mentioned mbeans. What are mbeans? When you're using WebLogic scripting tool and you're manipulating a domain or you're getting information from the domain, you are interacting with an mbean. And an mbean is a managed Java object. And it's not a WebLogic thing. An mbean is a standards-based object. It is defined by the Java Management Extension Design Specification, or JMX. So an mbean can represent an application or a library or any sort of deployment or WebLogic resource such as a server, a data store, anything that you can configure within WebLogic. So all those resources that you see, all those services that you see in the admin console, and all those tabs with all the properties, those are represented as mbeans within WebLogic, and you can manipulate and introspect any of those using WLST. So the JMX design specification exposes attributes and operations. So every mbean defines a standard set of operations and attributes, as well as custom operations and attributes. So think of it as an interface specification, whereas a standard attribute and operation may specify name or description or type. So get name, get type, get description. Those are standard, operations that apply to any WebLogic mbean. But then there are the custom operations that are specific to the mbean type, and there are many different mbean types, and you can actually look at the mbean reference guide. There's a link in the lab guide again that will show you all the various types of mbeans, and there are literally hundreds. And each type of mbean defines a set of operations and attributes that are specific for that mbean. So there's a server mbean, for example, and in a server mbean, you can define listen address, listen port, secure address, secure port, SSL and key store information for that server, and it goes on and on and on and on. So there will be specific attributes and operations for the server mbean and any mbean. So mbeans are organized like a file system, and there's a root directory. So think of an mbean hierarchy as a disk drive or a mount point. And then each mbean type and instances of those types are the directories. So what do I mean by type and instance? Well, let's talk about WebLogic servers. There's a server mbean type, and then an instance of that type would be an actual WebLogic server. So in the WebLogic server domain example that we've been working with, there's a server mbean type, which is the type of bean. And when we create managed servers, we are creating managed servers based off of the server mbean type. So an instance here would be the MS1, MS2, MS3 managed servers that we've created. And so think of those types and instances as directories. And then inside directories, you have files. So think of attributes and operations of an mbean as files. And so there are different types of hierarchies. There are configuration hierarchies, and there are runtime hierarchies. And there's a hierarchy for the domain as a whole and for each server. And the difference between a configuration and a runtime hierarchy is that a runtime hierarchy presents you an mbean hierarchy that's used to get runtime information about a domain or a server or an application. So if I want to know if a server is online or offline, I would look at the runtime hierarchy. However, if I want to change anything in the domain or the server or an application or a service, then I must be in the configuration hierarchy. And that is where I do any edits or updates to a domain. And so, as you've seen in the lab, we can connect to a domain either in offline mode or an online mode. And in offline mode, we typically do that to update a domain for deployment. In online mode, we are usually connecting to an admin server to perform online updates, such as maybe redistributing a resource to a different target, like a cluster or a managed server, or defining a data source and then setting a password. That can only be done in an online mode. And since the mbeans are organized like this directory structure, where you've got a root directory, then directories and subdirectories and files, you can navigate these mbean hierarchies using commands that you're familiar with, like change directory, listing, and print working directory. So cd, ls, and pwd. And they work just like they would if you were in Linux, OS 10, or not Windows, of course, because you would use dir instead of ls. In fact, I think WLST supports dir as well. So if you're familiar, if you work in Windows primarily and that's what you're comfortable with, I do believe WLST supports dir. WLST, like Python, all commands must end in parentheses, even if there are no arguments or parameters to pass in. That's why we see cd open close paren, ls open close paren, and so on and so forth. These are mandatory. But I'm not going to get into the syntax of Python here. So the syntax there's no specific WebLogic syntax here when you're writing WLST scripts. The syntax is purely Python. So don't think WLST is doing anything unique or special or manipulated the language in any way. Really, it's only providing Python-based or Jython-based functions on top of the base Python language. And in fact, I'm not sure for 12c, but in WebLogic 11g, WLST was based on Python 2.6.